All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to give a second for folks to come in. As you pop on, I'm trying to think, we usually do some kind of question when folks are coming in, but you're welcome to say your name, where you're from, and maybe, we're going into Thanksgiving, something that you're thankful for. Something that you're thankful for as a part of going into Thanksgiving. So while we're waiting for folks maybe to jump in, Ezra, what are you thankful for? What's something you're thankful for going into Thanksgiving?
I have so many things that I'm thankful for right now, but I would say most of all my family and my family's support. And I mean, my sister and I are really, really close, and I just saw her graduate from college. I finally got to see that because she graduated technically during COVID in 2020. So they finally got a graduation ceremony at her college. And I'm really thankful that I got to be there to see it.
I love that. That's awesome. And especially, I think when COVID pushes everything out, it seems just so amazing when you get to be there for those folks that you care about. I love definitely. That. That's awesome.
How about you? What are you thankful for?
Lots of things too. A lot of family stuff. I think I'm thankful for all of my family that's been super supportive. I'm thankful for my partner, Ethan. I'm thankful for my cats. I'm thankful for running, and honestly thankful for treatment and for recovery and being in a place that I think even a year ago, I couldn't have imagined being where I am now in terms of being able to feel joy and still struggle sometimes, but really experience life in a way that I never thought I could. And I'm really, really thankful for that.
So, yeah. That's awesome.
So, if folks come in and you want to share, you're more than welcome to drop where you're from and something you're thankful for in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and start with our disclaimers so we can jump into some conversation here. So really quickly, this live stream is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you're in distress or feel unsafe. If you're in a crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255. We also always want to create as safe a space as possible. So we encourage you to be kind and respectful, both in the chat now and those who might comment later. With that, know that this is being broadcast on various social media platforms and is being recorded. So please be mindful of that as you ask personal questions or leave comments. At the end of the day, this is all about being here to support one another. And yes, I see some nice yes. Okay, awesome. So you have some love coming at you already.
Yeah.
And I love that from your roommate. And then I see Alexandra, one of our advocates too, thankful for her son, husband, and amazing friends. Yes, also cute kittens. Sidebar, when I'm having a tough time, Alexandra sends me pictures of cute kittens. So that is something I am equally thankful for. Thankful for the love that you receive from friends and family. Thank you, Michelle. And great to see you too, a big part of our community also. So great to have folks on here. So we're going to go ahead and start to jump in. And I would just encourage folks as they come in to feel free and load up any questions or comments that you might have in the chat. We're going to start by having a little bit of a dialogue, and then we'll move into questions later, but we always kind of go through with the questions at the top first. So feel free to start putting things in whenever you feel comfortable. And I am really, really excited to be here with Ezra for this special kind of one-on-one conversation. And Ezra identifies as gender fluid and is in their second year at Lehigh University, where they're working towards an education specialist degree in school psychology. They graduated with a bachelor's degree from Muhlenberg College in 2018, majoring in psychology and minoring in creative writing and philosophy. Ezra was diagnosed with OCD in 2008 at 12 years old. They've been an active advocate for OCD awareness since 2015, when they started their first OCD awareness blog using Tumblr. In their spare time, Ezra enjoys creative writing, drawing, photography, knitting, singing, and playing guitar and ukulele, which I love. And I actually didn't know until you sent me this bio that you played ukulele, and I now feel like we need to gather and have a ukulele band. So
for sure.
So I'm really excited to just get to chat a little bit with you about your story. And for those coming on tonight, we are talking about gender-related stigma as a part of really this whole theme we're doing with the IOCDF right now on OCD across the gender spectrum. And our particular focus originally for tonight was gender-related stigma in the OCD community, specific to individuals who identify as transgender or non-binary. And Ezra, I'm really, really excited that I know so many that are watching either now or are watching later will be so excited to hear your story and to be able to connect with your authenticity. So thank you for being willing to do that. And I just wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your journey with OCD as an advocate, which has been going on for quite a while now.
Yeah. Well, I first was diagnosed with OCD when I was 12. As was said in the bio, that was 2008. So that was a pretty long time ago. But I originally was very anxious, even as a very little kid. I'm not sure exactly how far back my OCD symptoms go, but I can definitely remember some of my first compulsions in third grade, at the beginning of third grade. And I started receiving treatment about 3.5 years later, since my first, that I can recall, symptoms occurred. So I was in the summer between 6th and 7th grade. At that time, I was just a kid. So it was hard because I think a lot of what happened throughout my adolescence was really shaped by my journey with OCD. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that does mean that OCD has become very, very integral in terms of who I am. And I know that sometimes it can be hard to separate who you are from your OCD, but I think that gets especially hard for people that were diagnosed as kids, because it just does become something so ingrained. It's just that you have OCD and you're also all these other things. But that treatment, I mean, I used to go to treatment twice a week at one point. And when I was in, I think 7th and 8th grade, it was twice a week. And I mean, thank goodness I had the most supportive parents ever that were willing to drive me to those appointments and support me through all of the ERP that I did. But it was really, really difficult growing up with OCD. And then when I hit college, it became even more difficult because I came out in my freshman year as bisexual. And my OCD didn't like that, because something that I've talked to people about before is that OCD really latches onto anything important to you. And your identity is ideally something important to you, so OCD loves to latch onto that. And so that was something that I felt really anxious about, was whether or not I was actually bisexual or if I was quote unquote faking it. And that became even more anxiety provoking when I started to question my gender. And I think my whole life, I really didn't identify with my gender, but I didn't really know how to verbalize it until I was in college and I was learning about other gender identities in my psychology classes and realizing, okay, that actually sounds a lot more like me. And so doing my own research on it and questioning became more into answering those questions. The difference is that when you have OCD, questioning can become a little more intrusive for your well-being. And for a long time, I think I felt like I had to find the perfect label. So the perfect label, the just right label for my sexual orientation, the just right label for my gender. And it never really came. And I don't think it ever really does. I think part of the problem with gender identity is that it's not a problem. It's just, for people with OCD, it feels like a problem because it's so dynamic. And it's really challenging because with OCD, we like certainty. We like things being just right. And that's not how gender has ever been for me, or for many people, for most people, I would say. And then learning to live with that sort of uncomfortable feeling of not having the just right label because it doesn't exist has been hard, but I am working on it. And I actually recently started going by the name Ezra because I felt like that was like the final step in solidifying my identity and feeling comfortable with who I am. And this was really important to me because I had been trying out names for a long time. I would say for about a year. And I tried out a couple names and kind of retracted them because they didn't feel just right. And that was a huge issue for me as well. But I actually used the power of online communities that I'm a part of to kind of test out, say, hey, would you guys mind calling me Ez for a little bit? And feeling if that felt right. And at first I was like, well, nothing's going to feel right. And then I realized, well, that's actually not a bad thing. And I talked with my therapist a lot about it, who has been incredibly supportive, and talking about how, is there a just right name? Probably not. Just like everything else in my life, there's not a just right. And learning to be okay with that, and that knowing that something is right might not happen, but knowing that something is wrong does happen. And I think that was kind of how I felt. Like people ask me like, oh, your name is so beautiful, when they talk about my birth name, my legal name. And I think, well, it is a beautiful name. It's beautiful. I'm so glad my parents named me that. It's not beautiful for me. It's not a bad name. It's just not my name.
I love the way that you frame that the just right piece is never going to come, but you do know when something's wrong. And I think that's such a wider concept with OCD that's kind of come to me recently too. It's like, oh wait, things are always going to feel uncomfortable and they're never going to feel just right. But if something's actually not right, I'm going to somehow know, like instinctively, it's not even going to be this question. And it sounds like kind of with your name, that's really where that came from. And it's very interesting. I always connecting to what you're sharing. I always have students who are going through their kind of gender identity journey that will say, hey, just in this class, can you call me this? And we'll see kind of how it feels. And we'll kind of do that throughout the year. And then it might be, okay, I know that doesn't feel right. So we're going to try this. And it's really amazing. And I'm so glad that you're in a place where I think it's really neat that you've kind of come into who you are. And that's a really awesome thing, especially with OCD and everything else making that so challenging. So you talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your gender identity has played really a role in the OCD treatment and how you've navigated OCD treatment while also kind of trying to figure out who you are when OCD is saying, no, you're not. And you're saying, no, well, this is who I am. What does that look like for you? And maybe even what does the ERP kind of process look like?
Yeah. So I actually, when I was, I think when I was first sort of questioning my gender, so in like early college, maybe late high school, I didn't talk about it with my therapist. I felt like I couldn't verbalize how I was feeling because then it made it real. And maybe I was in the wrong. So is that like, maybe I'm not actually this way and I'm just thinking I'm this way and maybe I'm faking it, that feeling. So for a long time, it wasn't even something that was brought up in treatment for me. And I don't think I actually brought it up in a therapy session until like last year. And that was around the time that I was thinking of going by the name Zayden, which was a name that sounded similar enough, I felt, to my legal name that I could go for it and it would be an easy transition. But it didn't work out. It was not me. It was also one where I was just like, this doesn't feel right. And I was just going for a specific letter sound and it just wasn't working. And then talking about it in treatment, I like kind of slowly began to say to my therapist, I think I would kind of drop hints at first. I was trying to drop hints like about, I think, like even my sexual orientation, just saying something like when he'd ask how is it going with the dating apps, I'm like, well, I talked with this girl, and then like I didn't emphasize it, but I was trying to hint at things and without actually giving myself a label. And I did the same thing with gender, I would say, where I would sort of I don't even remember how I would phrase it, but I would think I was dropping hints. I don't know if I was. Sometimes I think I'm so subtle about my hints that they're not hints. They're just like statements that I think are hints, but they're totally not. And then I finally said, it took a lot to say something, because again, I didn't have quite in mind how I wanted to present as someone who's non-binary. And so I felt like if I don't have that exact image of who I want to be, I have no right to come out to people. And yet I think I said something about, even a couple months ago, I said that I was thinking of changing my name more drastically than prior. And we had talked about it. And I think one thing we did talk about when I was saying, he was like, well, how are you feeling about it? And I said, well, truthfully, I'm super nervous. And we talked about why. And I think a lot of it came back to that feeling of, what if I'm making a mistake? What if it's not just right? And part of the exposure of that is kind of doing it anyway and realizing that it doesn't have to be just right. And so I came up with the kind of mini exposure of talking to people slowly about it, and being okay with that uncertainty. And I like the fact that because I've been in treatment for so long, I actually can kind of come up with those exposures on my own sometimes. So there are some exposures that I still do that I'm like, I don't know how to do an exposure for this, but I need an exposure. And then there's other ones, like with my name, where I was like, part of this is just learning to deal with the uncertainty of it and just doing it.
I think everything that you shared, one, is so profound for folks listening who are navigating similar things, but just in general with life, with OCD, of being able to say, oh yeah, I'm never going to feel okay with whatever this thing is that I'm feeling led to do. And OCD is not necessarily going to let me feel like anything's just right. And the exposure is that I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to live into this anyway. And I love what you were sharing too about trying to kind of drop hints to your therapist about going through your process and letting your therapist know who you were. And I think I can relate to that, even with so many aspects of just life, of feeling like I've been really blunt with my therapist. I'm kind of, this thing. And they're like, huh, what now? I'm like, oh, never mind. And
never mind.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And, but I'm so glad that through that journey that you've had that support from therapists, and from your therapist, and from your family. And it sounds like folks in the chat are really connecting with that too. And Daniel, thank you for sharing in the chat, and for your affirmation. And Megan, I'm so glad that you have the support of family too. And I love that. And feel free, as we continue to talk, y'all are more than welcome to put in questions that you have for Ez, or just about OCD, about this journey, anything. And we're happy to plug in and to answer too. So I wonder, just from your perspective, what do you think the OCD community could do to support individuals across the gender spectrum in a way that is healthy and supportive and life-giving?
Yeah, I think the first step is what we're doing right now, which is just addressing that it is an issue for people with OCD, that uncertainty can lend itself to gender expression, and that, people aren't alone in feeling that way. Because when I first was dealing with it, I kind of thought it was OCD, but I thought it was the OCD in the way that it was like, oh, it's OCD because I'm fooling myself into thinking that I have gender dysphoria, and that that feeling of just right is me faking it. And then it wasn't really, it was almost me beating myself up over it. And yet I think addressing it and saying, this is a problem in our community is the first step. And also giving people the resources to learn more about gender expression in general is always helpful. So I think people, meaning like the therapists, I think would be helpful. Like, I'm so lucky that my therapist was accepting and knew that it was something I was struggling with and was okay with that. I think that can not always be the case, unfortunately. I'm not sure how exactly you can't address stigma and ignorance overnight, but you can kind of chip away at it. And I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. And I know I asked you this beforehand too, but I feel so fortunate that you have a therapist that's been supportive, because sometimes we do hear things with therapists who, or others in the community who are incredibly well-meaning, but might struggle with using preferred pronouns and chosen names that might not have paperwork that's gender inclusive. There are lots of different aspects. And actually, Alex, one of our advocates that's on here tonight, put together a really great graphic that's on the IOCDF Instagram right now, addressing some of the things that clinicians really can plug into. And I would love Jess behind the scenes, who's fantastic also, if you're willing to drop a link in the chat that we have also on a tip sheet for clinicians and in engaging in that way. Because having an inclusive practice is super important, and I'm so glad that you've had that experience. And it sounds like everything that you've navigated has also been it's really helped to be plugged in with a community online. And I would love to hear more about the social media and how that's influenced your advocacy, how it's influenced your identity, the ways that you've plugged in that community.
Or if they and it just said, like, when did you first have symptoms of OCD? When did you first realize you had OCD? What do you do to feel better? How are you in treatment? If so, how? And just kind of showing people that there's a face to OCD, and that OCD has so many different faces. And it was just a text post, but I got, I think I have 50 or so responses that from just Tumblr. And there's probably more in my inbox that I haven't looked at yet. And so I was really proud of that project. And then I started making like OCD based humor. I would share positivity posts. So I did a lot on the Tumblr community, and I saw that other OCD blogs were posting too. Like, they started coming up around, I'd say like 2017, there started to become a bit of a community on Tumblr. And almost all of the blogs that were originally there are not active anymore. But I've stuck around, and I'm really, like, I took a break for about 6 months this past semester because I was just going through graduate school, and I was really busy, but I'm trying to post again. And it feels really nice to be back in the community of just people wanting to learn more and feel heard and feel less alone. And that's been great. And on the darker side of things, Tumblr is a great resource, but it can also be a scary resource because so many people seem like on social media, no matter what social media platform, they seem like they know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly who they are. And I was like, well, I definitely don't feel that way. So am I wrong? Is there something wrong with me for not knowing? So then Googling and searching on Tumblr, different keywords, trying to figure out, do I feel like this identity? Do I feel like this identity? Trying to fit, honestly, a square peg into a round hole. It was just a lot of effort for no payoff, because it would just make me feel more and more alone the more I looked, because it was a compulsion. And I don't think I noticed. I think in the back of my head, I was like, this is making me feel worse, and it's probably OCD. But up in the rest of my head, I was like, all right, I gotta do more. And then the more I look, I'll find it. I'll find that just right answer. And this was actually pretty detrimental sometimes to my own well-being, because I would see people come up with these different terms or different phrases, and I think, well, maybe that one's it, and then kind of trying to do more research on it, and it never was really me. And it was just my OCD latching onto that, feeling, well, you're not 100% sure, so what if it's actually this thing instead? Or what if it's this thing instead? And that's why the internet's great, and social media is great, but you also have to sort of be aware of, when you have OCD, you have to be aware that it can lead you down a very spiraled path of intrusive thoughts and stress. So you have to kind of monitor yourself, and being able to check in. I remember at one point I was setting alarms for myself with my therapist, thinking like, checking in with myself, saying, am I doing compulsions right now? Am I looking things up, or am I feeling okay? How am I feeling right now? And just giving myself that permission to check in with myself was really helpful.
I love that you're bringing up that that internet piece, and then we're going to get into some questions too, because we have some great questions in the chat. But I just the internet piece for OCD as a whole, like you said, there's this kind of plus and minus piece, and I think about it all the time, because I enjoy the connection and the advocacy and all of those aspects. But I've had periods of my life too with OCD and all sorts of different themes where it's like, oh, it's so easy for me just to look up this one thing and then I'll know that this is my OCD and that this isn't my OCD and everything will be okay. And for me, a little bit different. I navigate mostly kind of harm related themes and false memory related themes and making sure I'm not a criminal or a bad person. And, went down the rabbit hole for more hours than I would love to say of making sure, oh, is this just OCD? And it makes you feel
even
worse.
looking up, is this OCD?
Oh yeah, so many times.
My favorite.
Like, does somebody else's symptoms match exactly mine? Yes. And if it doesn't, I mean, you're never going to get complete certainty because it'll be a little bit different. And then you're like, well, but this and that's kind of the pro and the con. Even with things like Instagram and with Tumblr that are so great where we can connect with others. Yeah, being mindful of, okay, maybe looking through it and making sure your symptoms are OCD for the next 6 hours is not helpful to your OCD, but connecting with others in other ways can be. So I love that you bring that up. It's, gosh, we love to have it be black and white. I would love to just be like, yeah, social media is great or social media is bad, but I guess
the gray area.
We have to kind of live in the gray and like yes and no. So I want to ask, and we can both tackle this. So Daniel at I've now lost his first question, which was great. Okay, Daniel at 718 said, I've wondered if my OCD developed as a way to cope with the overwhelming feelings of distress and anxiety I experienced from gender dysphoria. Any thoughts about this? I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about this, Ez, and then I can chime in too.
I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. I do think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think so. Again, and I'll put a caveat that I am not a clinician, but just from my advocate experience with OCD, I do think. Well, I think folks are generally predisposed to have OCD, but I do think that OCD can really come up and can emerge alongside particular life stressors. So I know for me, I talk a lot about. Yes, I was very much predisposed to have OCD, but issues of grief and of trauma really, really brought that out for me in ways that were really challenging. And even today, I work with my therapist a lot around the idea that sometimes I think my OCD is trying to help me cope with things that I struggle with and trying to help me cope with emotions that are really challenging. For me, I'm still in the process of, okay, for instance, I was having this conversation yesterday, processing a really difficult divorce, and OCD comes up around that all the time. And my therapist is like, it's literally because your OCD is trying to prevent you from feeling grief and sadness and anger and all of those things. So instead, it's giving you these feelings of anxiety, and it's latching on, and it's trying to protect you. It's trying to protect you in a way that's like really not helpful, but maybe trying to protect you. And I think that really can come up. And with what you're talking about too, with gender dysphoria, there must be such a journey that you've been throughout your life. And yes, as maybe someone predisposed with OCD, I could definitely see that coming up as you're trying to cope with things that are unfortunately really challenging in our society when they shouldn't be.
For sure. Yeah, I think you just said it, like that was said so well. And I think, unfortunately, gender dysphoria causes a lot of distress, and so it's one of those things where it's also something that's, I think I mentioned earlier, but it's very important to us and central to who we are is our gender identity. And OCD is one of those things that just loves to latch on to anything that you feel connected to.
Thank you. And I love that you go back to that too, because it's always those things that are literally the most significant and the most important to you. And what I hear from folks consistently, and the same thing that I say consistently, is whatever theme we have, it's always, well, I want the theme that person has. And if any other theme, like I would be totally fine, but just not mine.
It's funny because I actually used to think that way. And then like, I've been slowly collecting all the themes.
Me too.
So, yeah, I think that like as OCD starts to get better in one area, it's like, well, let me go to a different area then because you're weaker there, or supposedly weaker there because you haven't practiced with ERP in the longest time on this area. So I know I constantly have to keep things like my emetophobia has to be in check. And if I let too much time go by where I'm just like, I'm fine, then that comes back. And that was one of my first big fears, was the fear of throwing up. And then, I'm slowly collecting them all, but who's counting?
Yeah, it's fine. It's like Pokemon. Got to catch them all. That's a part of our, our OCD journey. It's, I think for me, it's like what you said. It's always, I want to have somebody else's theme. Mine seems like the most distressing to me at that time. And then it always tends to be whatever the theme is that I'm like, oh, theirs seems so much better. I want that one. Then eventually I end up with that one. I'm like, oh, this theme is not better, because it's all equally bad and just icky and yucky, just depending on whatever is so significant to you at that moment, and traumatic and not fun.
It's so important not to compare ourselves. And I think that's something we all do really well. Unfortunately.
Yeah. And I used to really not believe it, but everybody's is just as bad as the next person's. We're experiencing all of those things. But also, I guess on the hope side, and then we'll get into the next question, I really also believe that it's also really, really treatable. And that's the other thing that, and of course, individuals have different experiences with treatments that they go through and that they navigate. But I also went through so many stages where it wasn't only mine feels different, mine feels other, but also, oh, mine's the only one that treatment isn't going to work. And I hear that from folks often too. And thankfully with OCD, there are really great treatments where you really can live a full and beautiful life. And it doesn't mean that it's perfect, because things aren't perfect, as we know. But for all of these different subtypes, there is really treatment that works. And speaking of treatment, so Daniel says at 7:20, are either of you familiar with the approach of Dr. Michael Greenberg? He emphasizes the importance of figuring out your core fear to treat OCD. Thoughts or opinions? And I am not super familiar with his work. I don't know if you are.
I've never heard of him. And that's interesting to me, because I do research on OCD sometimes from a student perspective, but I don't recognize the name.
Okay. And have you ever, so with the research that you do, does anything ever come up with the core fear piece? What does that look like for you?
The closest I've found was sort of there was a model that was done in 2003 that I did I based some of my senior thesis off of for college, and it is the idea that you can have a core type of OCD. So there were different types of, like, the idea that there's a subtype of OCD. I have not heard that I've never personally read about that there being a core fear to OCD. I have heard that there's like supposedly core subtypes, although there's less evidence for some types of subtypes than others. So the categorization does matter. But I'm not familiar with the core fear issue. It sounds more psychoanalytic than I think I'm traditionally familiar with.
Yeah, and same with me. I mean, the only thing that I would say is I think a lot of people, and this is more from an experience standpoint, have a similar fear that kind of goes with them to different subtypes that might experience, just going back to strictly the thing that's the most important to you. So for me, my core fear pretty much in every obsession I've ever had is, what if I'm a horrific person? Literally, what if I am just this awful, awful, awful person? And every single subtype that's ever come up for me has really been that. So even now in recovery, one of the things that I continue to try to tackle and continue to do exposures around is not just all of the subtype pieces that come up with that, but that core fear of, well, maybe I am an awful person. Like maybe not, who knows? And I think a lot of folks have something that it boils down to. I don't know if that's your experience.
I used to think that, because I used to think it was, for me, it was like, oh, it's a lack of control. Like, I don't want to be not in control. But I have never been able to pinpoint my exact feeling there, because I've had like my subtypes jump from place to place. And I feel like, for example, the out of control feeling is different when I think about even gender identity. Like, having a label maybe is like, you could argue it's a control issue, but it's not as much as like I don't know, like with the emetophobia, it was more like I didn't like the sensation. And I was just afraid of that. But I think that could boil down to a control issue. So it's like, it's kind of tricky.
Mm-hmm. And I think here's kind of the good thing is I don't necessarily know that you have to have that question to treat your OCD. And that's
No.
kind of what it comes down to. And I've had this conversation a lot, like, well, it still comes back down to ERP for some, that's act two, and really exposing yourself to the thing that you're afraid of at that particular time. And well, if we don't figure out what that core piece is right now, I think you're still able to do exposures and to live into that treatment in a way that's meaningful. So, and Daniel, thank you. So at 7:26, Daniel says, you said, as a fellow Christian, someone who is trans, it's supportive to have a voice in this community. And let me, I guess I should have said before, I am an ordained minister. I'm an interfaith chaplain. I have OCD, and y'all are welcome to call me Katie. I always put Rev on these streams just because I like to raise awareness for the fact that clergy do struggle with mental health challenges too. But I also think it's super, super important for folks to hear that clergy, and I am definitely in this camp for all of the students that I work with every day, can be big, big, big allies in the LGBTQ plus community. And I am of the belief that all clergy really should be in that boat and be supportive to folks. So please know that you're loved, Daniel, and that you are not alone in your journey. Okay, let me see some more questions here. Okay, here to understand different issues with the OCD community. Okay, I think we've gotten through most of the questions. So I have another question for you that I was curious about. I was curious. So you've done some work also with our faith and OCD kind of piece, and I know you talked about Judaism coming in as a part for you with some of your OCD, and I wondered how faith potentially has fit in for you with this journey, because I know that there are a lot of ups and downs for people with that.
Yeah, there was a lot of stress for me in that regard. I actually wrote an article maybe almost a year ago. No, was it a couple months ago? I don't even remember. Time has no meaning. With COVID is no meaning. But I wrote an article about my journey with faith and OCD, because a lot of my OCD for a long time was stemmed from a fear of displeasing God. And I had this fear that it was, I think, partially because I was in Hebrew school, in Jewish day, like I didn't have a Jewish day school education, but in the afternoon, 3 times a week, I would go to Hebrew school. So that was a big part of my education growing up. And in 3rd grade, because I was going to Hebrew school 3 times a week, that was all, again, something that OCD really wanted to take on, and felt it was important to me. So it must be important to OCD. And because of that, I used to think, oh, well, if I don't do this, it wasn't just something bad would happen, but God would make this bad thing happen. So the train of thought would often be me praying to God, like, please don't make me throw up, for example, was the big one. And then it would be, if I do this, please don't make me throw up. Or if I do this, God won't make me throw up. And that was the very beginning of my OCD. And then when I got older, and OCD kind of shifted all over the place, it was challenging in a different way, because I think I began to associate a lot of my OCD symptoms with my faith, because I was so young when I started having the symptoms, and because the symptoms were so entangled in my own religion. And I honestly thought I was communicating with God. I thought, like I had a special relationship with him, and that, so learning that it was OCD was almost like losing a little bit of faith, a little bit at a time. And then as I started ERP for those symptoms, it was almost like ERP for my faith, but in like a negative way, where I started realizing I have control, but that means that I don't have the faith anymore. So for a long time, I really struggled with where does my faith factor into my treatment. And then I think it is further complicated by the fact that in my faith, I think they don't really talk about gender identity a lot, as far as I remember in my teaching. And, you know, and then it's one of those things where we don't really talk about like sexuality or sexual orientation either, but we do know that people weren't allowing same-sex marriage in the conservative Judaism relationship division until, so they weren't allowing same-sex relationships, especially between for marriage, that you couldn't get married in a conservative synagogue for a long time. And I think that was recently overturned. But because that took a while, I think I also felt like there might be some anxiety on that end. But the biggest piece for my faith is that in the Jewish tradition, we're named after someone who passed away. And you are named after someone who's no longer with us, who's very important to the parents. And so when I was given the name Zoe, it wasn't just a name that my parents liked. It was a name that signified my connection to my mom's dad, who we called Papa, who is, his name was Saul, and his Hebrew name was Zvulun, and that's where they got the Z from. And so that was why I tried for such a long time to find a name with a Z or an S, because I was so afraid of ruining that chain, that there was such a fear of the name, because the name meant more than I think it would have if I was any other religion. Wow. So that was also part of why I chose the name Zayden at one point. And when it didn't work out, I was like, all right, I'm going back to Zoe, because that I'm just going to kind of swallow my discomfort. And I didn't want to get rid of that connection that I've always had to my grandfather, even though, you know, it's more than that. And I think it was also about my connection to my mother. It's a connection to like my family tree, my sister's name for my grandmother. So it was all like the connections and interconnectivity that really worried me. And then I kind of realized, well, it doesn't have to be the end all be all here. And I really started thinking about what's a name with maybe Z in it. So I can have a part of me still connected to that part of my faith, while I still feel the most like me. And also realizing again that there's no just right name, but there is names that make me feel dysphoric or don't feel quite easy to hear. So I think it was really important to me that I find a name with Z in it if I could. And so finding the name Ezra and going by Ez with Z ending in it felt like the right call, because not only did I feel most like me when I heard it, but I knew that I still had that part of me in it.
You're going to choke me up. That's really, I didn't know any of that. And that's,
I forget that that's not a common practice, because I was raised that way. So it's interesting.
Well, and I knew that name piece from Chief, but I didn't know how it connected to you, or that impacted your journey the way that it did with living into your identity. And I think even going back to what we've talked about tonight, it's so beautiful that you were able to, even from an OCD perspective, get out of that black and white thinking of, oh, it has to be this and it has to start with a Z, and find and really just uncover the name that feels like you, and that there's a connection, but that it doesn't have to be just so or just right.
Exactly.
That's cool. That's really, really cool and so powerful. And I also equally appreciate the work that you've done, even with some of the videos and things that we've done around the faith communities, letting folks know that faith and OCD don't have to be mutually exclusive. But also I hope folks on here tonight know that there really is a spectrum in all different faith traditions. And there really are facets of each faith tradition that are inclusive of the LGBT community. So please know that you're not alone with that too. And that unfortunately, there are some spaces that I know it can be really challenging. But folks watching, please know that you really are welcomed, and in whatever faith tradition you are loved by God. And I hope you hear that from me too. So I wonder, just in these last 10 minutes, for anybody who's listening either now or listening later, who is navigating OCD, maybe who identifies as non-binary or identifies more specifically as gender fluid, anything like that. Do you have any words of wisdom that you would give them as they're going through their journey?
Yeah. I think the biggest one is kind of the theme of the night, which is just like, it doesn't have to be just right for it to feel okay. And I think that feeling of like, I remember when I was working at a nursery school, this was my senior year of high school. I was interning at a therapeutic nursery school, and they used to tell the kids, you can be okay. And I liked that. It wasn't you are okay, but you can be okay. So it's okay to not always be okay. And it's also okay that like, so that feeling of it not being just right it's okay. And it doesn't feel okay right now, but you can be okay with it. You can start to train yourself to be okay with it. You can sit with that uncertainty of it's not the just right name. It's not the just right label. It's not the just right identity. And it doesn't have to be the end of the world. And I would challenge those who right now are feeling how maybe I felt, where maybe their name is something important to them, but they need that extra push, or they feel like their label isn't quite right. I would challenge you to think, well, you want to live as your most authentic self. I think that's the most important thing. And at the same time, you are the best judge of you. And when OCD sometimes latches onto that, it can feel we can doubt ourselves. But in those moments where you feel good, that's what's important. And I used to think to myself, well, how can I feel good in multiple gender expressions, and how can that be okay? And then I was like, well, it just is. Like, it doesn't have to be the just right feeling all the time, but I can be okay with that. Like, I think that was really important for me too. And knowing that gender fluidity and being gender fluid is valid. And I didn't want it to be valid for my own self, because I felt like there had to be a more concrete option. But because there isn't, I can be okay with that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think it's so neat and I haven't known you for all that long, but I've seen you in advocacy for a long time, and it's neat to be here with you tonight. And you can really feel that you found a sense of who you are. And I think that's probably inspiring for so many, because this just feels like authentically you, and it's a beautiful thing. So thank you so much for inspiring others. Oh, I see Chris first, before Chris's question, I see a question from John, and around resource suggestions for scrupulosity. So a couple different things here. For folks who are watching, there's both moral scrupulosity and religious scrupulosity. There are a lot of awesome resources on the IOCDF website for moral scrupulosity right now, but particularly in the religious scrupulosity area, we are getting ready to put out a whole new website on faith and OCD, which is really, really exciting. And we're hoping to have this up by the end of the year. We will see. We have a meeting actually about this tomorrow, so to be determined, but it is in really good shape. And we're actually going to have sections specifically for you to share with clinicians about your faith tradition, for you to share with faith leaders about your OCD journey, and also for individual sufferers to kind of look at things that they might be experiencing as a part of scrupulosity. Right now, you can feel free to check out iocdf.org/OCD and faith. And we have the resources that we have up there currently, but it's all going to be new within the next couple of weeks. So I would encourage you, John, to check back there, because we're going to have some really neat things up there. And then we have Chris. So hi, Chris. And Chris is one of our awesome lead advocates who leads our LGBT SIG and does a bajillion things for the IOCDF. And he says there are so many additional challenges an individual who is gender nonconforming with OCD faces, and glad you're discussing the topic. My question for Ezra is, how have you seen the two overlap for you? And also, how can the OCD community be more supportive to the non-binary community? I know we talked about that a little bit earlier, but I wonder if you can kind of summarize again what that might look like.
Yeah. Well, I think the main way it overlaps is in that not feeling, just right feeling, and that non-binary is such a fluid identity for a lot of people, even if they're not specifically identifying as gender fluid. And because it's that gray area, that in between in a way, or that outside the box, it really doesn't sit well with most of us with OCD, because not that we're not accepting of ourselves, but kind of we're not accepting of the fact that we can't be one or the other. And that tends to be an issue for a lot of people with OCD in general, but it can be especially detrimental to those with non-binary identities, because we don't fit into the mold of the one or the other. And that inability to be that black and white thinking, be able to conform to that black and white thinking, it can feel hard, and it can feel like a lot of questioning and Googling and compulsions. And I think that's how the OCD community can be more supportive, is by recognizing that it is an issue, and supporting those who have non-binary identities, by just being there and validating that it's an issue, and educating others, and just saying that we've been heard. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Ez. And just to speak to a comment after Chris, I think this is awesome. Thinking about kind of how we judge ourselves and things like that. I think thinking about who the best judge of us is, and as you might have a perspective on this too, but I think a lot of times what happens, particularly with OCD, it's not necessarily that we aren't the best judge of ourselves. I think we still are, but I think the OCD makes us question who we are.
Yes.
And I think there's, I know some of us talk in the OCD community about wise mind, and wise mind kind of always being there, where you deep down somewhere kind of know who you are and know what your values are, but OCD puts the what if in front of all of those things.
For sure.
And I think treatment is about stripping all of those what ifs away, so that you fully can be the best judge of yourself, and so that you can listen to that small voice that still exists. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
For sure. That's exactly how I was feeling. I was thinking, well, we are the best judge of us because we're us, but sometimes we're not our mental disorders. Like, I think they can influence us, they can be a part of us, but we aren't who they make us out to be a lot of the time. So when depression is saying to me, oh, you're pathetic, like, that doesn't mean I'm pathetic. And that doesn't mean I'm saying that I'm pathetic. It's saying the depression is calling me pathetic. And when I am really me and not colored by depression, I know that I'm not pathetic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think with the OCD, yeah.
Oh yeah, same with the OCD, and it all gets back to that kind of self-compassion piece too. I know that we talk about often, and I feel very much the same way. My OCD says horrible things about me all the time, and it's, well, what if I'm this, and what if I'm not, and what if I'm a bad person, and what if I'm dangerous? And I think the reason for me that it hurts so much is because it's attacking things that directly have to do with my core identity. It's opposing things that have to do with my core identity. And when all of that gets stripped away, I'm able to really know and to see, oh, wait, the reason that those things hurt is because of who I actually am, and because I do know who I am. And that's one of the reasons I think treatment is so incredibly important, so that you can get back to not only being the best judge of yourself, but having confidence that you're the best judge of yourself, despite all of the what ifs and all the stuff that pops up for you. So I hope that y'all hear that too, that just no matter what your mind is saying to you, you deserve love, and you deserve compassion, and that little wise mind piece of you that you're like, oh, those are the things I like, and that's probably who I am. Like, try to listen to that, even if everything else tells you not to. Okay, so in just the last couple of minutes, any final thoughts? As I know we kind of did a closeout, and then we had another question. So any like final sentences to say to everybody?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think everything. It's been really wonderful getting to speak with you, and I'm really glad that I have the platform to be able to share about having a non-binary identity and having OCD.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This has been so special, and I've loved, honestly, just getting to learn a little bit more about you and your journey, and I know that inspires so many. So just a few quick final housekeeping items before we jump off. Big thing, if you are interested in all that the OCD community is doing, please register for the online OCD camp. It's created especially for youth between the ages of 6 and 17, and it's going to have 2 days of interactive sessions and activities for 3 different age groups. In addition, the program will include sessions for parents and guardians and opportunities for fun and socialization with other families. So you can learn more and register at iocdf.org/OCD camp. That's taking place in January. And it's also going to be really fun. I have some kind of random session with scavenger hunts and TikToks and all kinds of stuff going on for teens. So please join us. We're going to have an awesome time. And if you're interested in more of our upcoming live streams, we encourage you to join the Peace of Mind virtual community at iocdf.org/peace of mind. There you can view the live stream schedule and submit topics and questions for future events. Please know that if you have any questions after the stream, or even if you're watching this at a later time and we're not here to answer live, you can feel free to go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to submit your questions, or you're more than welcome to contact the IOCDF at, thank you, info@iocdf.org. I was kind of blanking on that there for a second. And you can always look for resources at iocdf.org. Please remember to like and subscribe. So as we're jumping off, a big thank you to everyone who watched tonight and everyone who will watch later. A big thanks to Jess behind the scenes, and especially a huge thanks to you, Ez, and thank you so much for your vulnerability. And I think anyone who watches this will be just so moved by how vulnerable and authentic that you've been. And just thank you for sharing.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.